warehouse was on Denver's south side, a big industrial box with roll-up doors and steel framing, the kind of place that looked empty until it wasn't. We pulled up to a column of brown smoke pushing hard against the sky. You could hear the fire before you saw it, that low roar like a freight train trapped indoors. Heat poured out of every seam. The air tasted like hot dust and old chemicals, dry enough to make your throat feel raw through the mask. Inside was worse. The light changed fast, from daylight to that pulsing orange you get when flames are chewing through stored junk. The floor was cluttered with pallets and busted shelving. The building creaked and popped, metal expanding, bolts complaining. The radio chatter was steady, clipped, professional. We did what we were trained to do: hose line forward, search pattern, listen for victims, watch your partner, watch the ceiling. Then the tone in the radio shifted. Somebody called structural compromise. You don't argue with that. Not in a warehouse, not when the heat is banking and the smoke is dropping and the place starts to feel like it's breathing. "Walker, that's a direct order. Pull out," the captain said. I should have moved. I did move, for half a step. And then I heard it. A scream, sharp and raw, too clean to be metal and too human to be wind. It cut straight through the noise like it had been waiting for a gap. My body reacted before my brain could. My grip tightened on the line. My heart jumped into my throat. The hair at the back of my neck tried to stand up under my hood. "I don't hear anything, man," Tyler said. I turned my head like that would help, like there was a direction to it. The sound hit again, closer this time, and I swear I felt it in my teeth. I didn't see anyone. The thermal didn't give me a shape I could point at, but my ears didn't care about the screen. My ears told me there was somebody in there. "I heard him," I said. That was the moment everything split. Training on one side, instinct on the other. I pushed deeper, calling out, sweeping my light, trying to pick a path through smoke that kept folding in on itself. Behind me, boots pounded. 2 guys came after me, not because they believed me, but because I was theirs, and you don't let one of your own disappear in a bad building. The ceiling let go in a way that didn't sound like a crash. It sounded like the whole place deciding all at once that it was done. Something slammed down hard enough to shake the floor. Tyler went down with a shout that wasn't fear so much as surprise. We got dragged out in a knot of arms and hose and ash, coughing into our masks, eyes burning, shoulders screaming from the effort. Afterward, there were forms, interviews, replayed radio traffic, the kind of fluorescent lit room where everything feels smaller than it should. They checked the roll of employees. They checked the surrounding businesses. They checked for reports. No missing persons, no trapped worker, no signature on the thermal that held up under review. Nothing to match what I said I heard. They didn't fire me. That almost felt worse. They wrote it up as a failure to follow a direct order and a decision that led to injury. Then they moved me out of the city, like they were putting a problem somewhere quiet. I didn't quit. I couldn't. This is the only work I've ever been any good at, and walking away would have been the same as admitting the scream was in my head. I kept telling myself I'd take the hit, do the time, and come back clean. What I didn't understand yet was that fires don't just leave you alone because you change stations. I left Denver with the kind of quiet you only get after someone tells you you're not welcome where you used to belong. Nobody said it like that. The paperwork didn't. The captain didn't. The union rep didn't. It was all polite language and neutral faces, like they were rearranging a schedule and not a person. Reassignment, evaluation, a fresh start. The same words people use when they don't want to admit they're moving you out of sight. I packed light, a duffel, a small box of personal stuff I didn't even realize I'd collected, a spare radio strap I'd paid too much for, my old Academy hoodie that still smelled like detergent from a brand you couldn't find anywhere else. I didn't take anything off my locker that might feel permanent. I told myself I'd be back. It mattered that I believed that. The city fell away fast once I hit the edge of the metro. Traffic loosened, buildings dropped down, the horizon got wider, and the sky looked like it had more room to breathe. I drove north with my hands set at 10, and 2 like I was still in a rig. Every few miles I caught myself scanning for smoke the way I always did. A low gray smear on the horizon could make my shoulders tighten without permission. That didn't stop just because you weren't on duty. The highway narrowed after a while. Fewer lanes, fewer signs, fewer exits. It wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, like the world was thinning out. The radio stations started to fade, one by one, until I was flipping through static and country songs that sounded like they'd been recorded in somebody's garage. Wind pushed at the car hard enough to make it drift if I wasn't paying attention. The kind of wind that didn't just touch you. It leaned. Grassland took over. Not the postcard kind with perfect green hills, but the honest kind. Pale, dry, endless. Fence lines running straight until they vanished. A few cattle in the distance that looked like dark dots against the earth. The smell changed when I cracked the window. Dust. Old sun. Something faintly sweet and sharp, like sage crushed under a boot. By the time I crossed into Wyoming, I felt like I'd been driving into a different version of the country. Same language, same flag on the poles. But the scale was wrong. Out here you could see weather coming from a long way off. You could see smoke, too. That was the thing I couldn't ignore. Out here, there wasn't much to hide it. Buffalo showed up the way small towns do when you're not looking for them. A few blocks of businesses, a couple bars, a grocery store that looked like it closed early. Trucks parked along the curb with dust baked into the paint. A courthouse that stood a little too proud for how quiet the streets were. The mountains sat off in the distance like a backdrop somebody forgot to take down, and the wind never stopped moving, even in town. It slipped through gaps between buildings and made signs clack against their brackets. The station wasn't hard to find. You could tell it by the bay doors and the wide driveway, and the fact that everything around it looked like it knew to stay back. One engine in the bay, one brush truck parked off to the side like it lived there. The building itself was modest, not run down, not shiny. A place that did what it needed to do and didn't pretend to be anything else. I sat in my car for a second with my hands on the wheel. It wasn't nerves exactly. It was that feeling you get right before you walk into a room where everyone already knows your name. Not because you're famous, because your file got there before you did. The door inside was unlocked. Of course it was. Small town, small crew. I stepped into air that smelled like disinfectant and old coffee and something fried from last night. There was a bulletin board by the entrance with laminated safety notices and county announcements, and a calendar with call shifts written in blocky marker. The place sounded different than Denver, not quieter in a peaceful way. Quieter in a way that made you hear everything you normally ignored. The hum of fluorescent lights, the faint rattle of a vent, the soft click of boots on tile. A man came out of the office like he'd been waiting, not rushing. Late 40s, solid build, short hair going gray at the temples, calm eyes, the kind of face that didn't waste expression. "You'll be on nights," Steve said. He'd already looked at my paperwork, my full name printed in block letters across the top. Chris Walker. He didn't introduce himself first. He didn't ask how the drive was. That was the introduction. Nights, like it was already decided what kind of man I was going to be out here. I nodded and told myself not to take it personally. Night shifts were short-handed everywhere. Night shifts were where you put the new guy until you knew what you had. Night shifts were a punishment if you wanted them to be. Steve Coleman, captain. I'd already read it in the email. Seeing him in person, it made sense. He looked like he'd been doing the job long enough to stop talking about it. He walked me through the bay, pointing out the obvious, where the medical bags were, where the spare air bottle sat, where they kept the wildland packs. The engine was clean but not polished. Tools were staged like hands had put them there with purpose. The brush truck looked like it had been washed last week and already regretted it. 2 more guys were at the kitchen table. One was older than me, early 40s maybe, with the kind of posture that never fully relaxed even when he was sitting. His eyes tracked me the way you track a moving object in the dark. The other was younger, late 20s, leaned back in his chair like he owned the place, a half smile that didn't feel mean. Steve nodded toward them. Brian Clark didn't stand. He just watched. Kyle Bennett offered a quick wave like he'd met 100 guys passing through and didn't see a reason to make it complicated. Brian kept looking at me like he was waiting for a sound I hadn't made yet. Not angry, not suspicious, just attentive. Like he'd learned to pay attention to the wrong things because the right things would get you killed. The kitchen window faced open land, and the wind hit it in pulses, making the glass shiver. I could see fence posts out there, and a long stretch of road that disappeared into the same pale grass I'd driven through. It felt less like the edge of town, and more like the edge of everything. "Wind carries sound out here," Brian said. He said it the way you'd say water's wet. Not a warning, not a joke, just a fact he expected me to file away. Kyle snorted, but not in a disrespectful way, more like he was agreeing without wanting to sound like he was. "Guess the city's louder," Kyle said. I didn't answer. Part of me wanted to say I'd take loud over empty any day. Another part of me didn't want to give them anything, not yet. Steve moved to a bulletin board near the hallway. That's when I noticed the other board beside it. Whiteboard, worn edges, names in marker, some crossed out, some scrubbed so hard you could still see the ghosts of letters. No dates, no notes, no retired or transferred or anything you'd normally see. Just space where names used to be. My eyes stuck there longer than they should have. Brian saw it. Kyle saw it. Steve didn't look at it at all, like he'd made a deal with himself a long time ago. "We keep it simple here," Steve said flatly. The way he said it made my throat tighten, because it didn't sound like an invitation. It sounded like a boundary. "Simple how?" I asked. Steve held my gaze for a beat, not challenging, measuring. Then he nodded once toward the bunk room, like the conversation was over and the day had tasks to get through. The wind hit the building again, hard enough to make the bay door rattle. Somewhere outside, a loose sign tapped metal in a steady rhythm, like someone knocking without using their hand. I told myself it was just a small-town station doing things their way. I told myself I'd sleep through the night, run the calls, keep my head down, and earn my way back. But sitting there at that kitchen table, with the planes stretching out behind the glass and my name fresh on their schedule, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't here because I needed a fresh start. I was here because someone decided I was the kind of guy who needed fewer places to run. Night shifts out there didn't start with a rush. They started with the building settling around you, like it was taking inventory. The wind kept working the siding. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. Somewhere in the back, a fridge motor kicked on and off. In Denver, there was always background noise, always something moving. Here, the quiet had edges. I got assigned a bunk in a locker that still smelled like the last guy's detergent. I unpacked the few things I'd brought and tried not to stare at the empty hooks beside mine. The station felt lived in, but not crowded. 4 men could take up a lot of space when they wanted to. Tonight, nobody was trying. Steve ran the start of shift the way you'd run a checklist. He didn't do speeches, he didn't do jokes. He walked through the bay, checked the rigs, looked at the gauges, and made sure everything was where it belonged. Brian moved with him, quiet, reliable, hands always doing something small. Kyle hovered nearby, eager without being annoying, like he still had some leftover energy to spend. I kept waiting for the questions. I'd done enough transfers to know the rhythm. Where you came from. Why you're here. How bad was it? What happened? They didn't ask. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was worse. It was like they'd already decided it didn't matter. We ended up in the kitchen without anyone calling it a meeting. Steve poured coffee into a mug that looked older than me. Brian leaned on the counter with his arms crossed. Kyle sat at the table and spun a pen between his fingers like he was bored, but his eyes didn't stop tracking Steve. Steve reached into a drawer and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. Not a binder, not a policy packet. One page, creased like it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. He slid it across the table toward me and tapped it once with 2 fingers. "Read it," Steve said. The paper was plain white, no letterhead. The title at the top was typed in simple font like someone had printed it at home. "Night Fire Addendum, After Midnight Calls." That line alone made my stomach tighten because nobody writes addendums for fun. Addendums are for things that went wrong. Below the title were 5 rules, numbered, no extra wording, no explanation, no disclaimers. The kind of language you use when you don't want room for interpretation. Rule 1. If you hear a scream, ask the person beside you if they hear it. Rule 2. If they don't, you don't advance. Rule 3. If the voice uses your name, nobody goes in. Rule 4. If you're the one who hears it, you don't lead the entry. Rule 5. If you pull back 100 feet and you still hear it, nobody turns around. I read them once and didn't react because that's how you survive in a new house. You don't show too much. You don't make a face like you're judging. You keep it neutral, even when something in you wants to call it out. I read them again, slower. Rule 1 and 2 sounded like they'd been written by someone who understood how fast a mind could lie to itself under stress. How sound bends in structures, how your brain fills in gaps when you're exhausted. It looked like a workaround for adrenaline and bad acoustics, the kind of tool a small crew would use to keep one guy from going hero in the wrong moment. Rule 4 felt like a safety thing, too. If you were the one who thought you heard a victim, you weren't the one who should charge in first. You put space between impulse and action. You let someone with a calmer head take point. Rule 5 was the first one that didn't fit. 100 feet wasn't a magical distance. It wasn't even a clean operational marker. It was close enough to still be in it, still breathing it, still watching flame behavior. But it was far enough that, if you were still hearing screams at that distance, something was wrong in a different way. It read like someone had learned that the hard way. Then there was Rule 3. If the voice uses your name, no one enters. Not you don't enter. No one. That wasn't written to protect one person. That was written to stop a whole crew from making the same mistake together. I looked up at Steve. He didn't look back right away. He stared into his coffee like the mug had answers. I could have laughed. I could have asked if this was a joke, some weird hazing thing for city guys. But nobody was smiling. Kyle had stopped spinning his pen. Brian's eyes were fixed on the paper like he was memorizing it again, even though a man like that didn't forget things. "This about wind distortion?" I asked. I kept my voice even, professional, like I was asking about a hose load. Steve finally met my eyes. His face didn't change, but something in his expression tightened, like he'd heard that question before, maybe from the last guy, maybe from himself. "It's about coming back," he said. That was all. He didn't say where the rules came from. He didn't say who wrote them. He didn't tell a story about a bad call or a dead firefighter or an investigation that forced their hand. He didn't even use the word scream. He let the paper do the talking and expected me to respect it. I stared at the rules again and tried to fit them into a world that made sense. Small departments did odd things. They got superstitious. They passed down habits like they were law because there wasn't a training division to smooth out the edges. Guys who'd been on the job long enough would rather hand you a piece of paper than admit they were scared of something they couldn't explain. That's what I told myself. This was stress management dressed up as policy. A way to keep a 4-man crew from getting killed because one guy's brain decided to play tricks in the middle of smoke and heat. I folded the sheet back the way it had been folded and slid it into my pocket. It felt too thin to carry any weight, and still it sat there like a brick. Brian pushed off the counter and walked toward the bay without a word. Kyle followed, glancing at me like he wanted to say something but didn't know if he was allowed. Steve finished his coffee and set the mug down carefully, like noise mattered. The wind hit the building again. The lights flickered once, not enough to go dark, just enough to make the room feel less steady. I told myself it was old wiring and weather and a station that ran on simple equipment in a place that didn't need much. Then I felt the paper in my pocket, and I knew I'd be thinking about it all night. The first few nights settled into a rhythm that felt almost insulting in how normal it was. I'd been braced for something, even if I wouldn't admit that out loud. I'd been braced for the kind of friction you get when a new guy walks into a small house with a big city patch on his shoulder. I'd been braced for the whispered version of the story they'd heard about Denver, the one that always sounds worse when it gets passed around. None of that showed up. What showed up was work. Not the kind of work that makes the news, not the kind of work that gets a crowd of phones pointed at the scene. Just calls that came in, got handled, and faded back into the dark like they'd never happened. Out here, the night didn't feel like a stage. It felt like a place people lived and sometimes messed up and sometimes needed help, and that was it. The station itself ran like it had to. There wasn't a training division. There weren't extra bodies. There wasn't a spare rig tucked in the back bay, just in case. Everything was about being ready with what you had. That made the little habits matter more. Steve checked things without making a show of it. Brian checked things without even seeming to check. Kyle checked things like he wanted to learn them by touch, not by memory. On my first night, Steve had me run through the engine with him, not a tour. A walkthrough, gauges, valves, compartments, where they kept their medical bag, where the spare air sat, where the wildland packs were stored, the straps worn smooth from use. The brush truck was a different animal than the city rigs I was used to, lighter and built for getting off pavement. It looked like something you'd drive into a place you didn't want to get stuck. Even the air felt different. In Denver, smoke always felt like it had a layer of everything the city carried: oil, chemicals, rubber. Here, the air was cleaner until it wasn't, and when it turned fast. Wind didn't just push flame, it reshaped it. It made a small fire act bigger than it was and made a big fire move like it had a mind. The first call I ran in Buffalo was a brush fire off a county road that wasn't much more than hard dirt and gravel. Somebody had dumped ash where they shouldn't have, or a spark had jumped from a burn barrel into dry grass. Nothing dramatic, but the wind made it tricky. It ran low and quick, a ribbon of orange that stayed close to the ground. Fire out here didn't need to climb, it just needed space. We staged the engine upwind, because you learn fast that downwind is where you lose your lungs. Brian had Kyle and me pull hose while Steve stayed on the radio and watched the edge. I checked my SCBA the way I always did, even though I knew I probably wouldn't put the mask on. Force of habit, bottle pressure, straps, regulator, the simple things that kept you alive when the simple things stopped being simple. We used flappers and a short handline where it made sense. The brush truck circled the far side, laying a thin, wet line to keep it from running under the fence. The smell was dry and sharp, like burnt straw and dust. The heat wasn't the deep, punching heat of a structure. It was quick and close, enough to prickle your skin and make sweat jump out on your forehead. It was manageable. It was work. When it was done, we rolled hose, stowed tools, and drove back without saying much. There was no adrenaline hangover, just a calm tiredness that sat in your shoulders. The next night, we got a false alarm at a small business on the edge of town. A sensor tripped, or a duct got hot, or the system was old and had a mind of its own. We walked the building with a thermal camera and flashlights. The place smelled like cleaning product and stale fryer grease, not smoke. No heat signatures where there shouldn't be any. No flicker of flame, just Quiet rooms and humming refrigerators and a back door that stuck in the frame. We reset the panel. We told the owner what we could. We left. There were calls like that, too. The kind where you feel like you're wasting someone's time until you remember that the whole point is getting there before it's real. Between calls, station life had its own slow pressure. You clean, because if you don't, grime takes over. You check gear, because if you don't, it fails when you can't afford it. You eat when you can, because nights steal your appetite and then punish you for skipping meals later. Kyle cooked something heavy one night, meat and potatoes, the kind of meal that made sense in a place where winter lasted longer than it should. Brian ate like he was fueling up, not enjoying it. Steve ate quietly and wiped his hands with a paper towel folded neatly like he was still at a desk somewhere. I kept thinking about the folded sheet in my pocket, even on nights when I didn't touch it. I didn't bring it up again. I didn't want to be the guy who couldn't let it go. But it was hard to ignore the fact that I'd been handed rules that sounded like they belonged to a different job. A different kind of call. The kind of call nobody wanted to put a name to. The thing was, the nights didn't give me anything to feed that worry. There were no screams, no strange voices, no moments where the wind turned and made the world feel wrong. It was almost disappointing, like I'd come out here prepared for a storm and only found clear sky. We had a small barn fire a few nights in. Not a big ranch operation, just an old structure behind a house with some tools and hay and who knows what else. The owner met us in the driveway, breath steaming, face tight with anger at himself more than anything. You could see the orange pulse through cracks in the siding. A barn is a simple building, but it burns hard because everything inside it wants to burn. Dry wood, hay, old oil, dust. We set up on the engine, pulled a line, and kept it defensive. The wind kept shifting, pressing smoke down low, and it made everything feel closer than it was. You'd take a step, and the smoke would fold around you like a curtain, and then you'd step again, and it would tear away. Kyle swept the doorway with the thermal and shook his head. "Nothing inside," Kyle said. Brian didn't even glance at him before answering. "Keep it exterior," Brian said. Steve watched the roofline, eyes steady. "Hold the line," Steve said. "We hit it from the outside, knocked down what we could and let it burn where it wanted to burn while we kept it from spreading to the house. That's the job sometimes. It's not saving everything. It's saving what you can and not getting anyone killed doing it. After we overhauled what was safe, we packed up. The owner thanked us with that exhausted gratitude people have when they know it could have been worse." We drove back with the windows cracked because the cab smelled like smoke, even through the gear bags. It clung to you. It always did. On nights with no calls, the station felt like a boat anchored in a sea of dark. The wind never stopped. It would hit the building in waves, then ease up, then hit again. Sometimes it made the bay door rattle. Sometimes it made the flag outside snap like a whip. The quiet out here wasn't silence. It was space. There were moments when I'd catch myself listening harder than I needed to. The way you listen when you've convinced yourself you missed something once. In Denver, you didn't have time for that. You had too many calls, too much noise, too many voices. Here, the quiet gave your mind room to wander, and my mind wasn't a safe place to wander into at 2 a.m. I'd think about the warehouse. I'd see the way the smoke moved, the way the orange light pulsed against steel, the way the scream cut through everything like a blade. I'd feel the split-second decision again, that flicker between obedience and instinct. I'd imagine what I could have done differently. I'd imagine what Tyler's shoulder felt like when it gave under the weight of the collapse. I'd imagine his face later, trying not to blame me because that's what firefighters do. They swallow it and keep going. Then I'd look around the Buffalo station and realize nobody here seemed interested in blaming anybody for anything. They treated me like a working piece they could use. That should have been comforting. In a way, it was. Kyle had the energy I remembered having when I was younger. He still believed the job was mostly about action, mostly about momentum. On slow nights, he'd pace, scroll his phone, check the rigs again like maybe a call would appear if he was ready enough. Brian had the stillness of someone who'd outgrown that. He could sit in a chair for an hour without moving, eyes open, like he wasn't waiting for a call so much as watching the night. Steve was somewhere in between, always present, always listening, never wasting words. At some point, I realized I hadn't thought about the rules in a full hour. That felt like progress. It felt like my brain finally letting go of the thing it wanted to chew on. Denver started to feel farther away, not in miles, but in weight. The more normal calls we ran, the easier it was to tell myself the warehouse was a one-time mistake, a bad combination of heat, noise, stress, and my own need to be right. Auditory distortion, panic, the mind filling in blanks, all the explanations that let you sleep. I started to imagine going back to the city eventually, walking into my old house with my head up. I imagined Tyler giving me a nod that said we were good, because that's the kind of nod you live for. I imagined the captain treating me like I'd earned my way back instead of being a problem somebody moved out of the way. That's how the nights got me. They didn't scare me. They eased me down. They made me believe I'd overreacted, that I'd made something bigger than it was, and that the universe had handed me a quiet place to reset. One night, after we'd finished cleaning up from a minor call and the station had gone still again, Kyle leaned against the counter and looked out the kitchen window at the dark land beyond the lights. "Feels quiet tonight," Kyle said. Brian didn't look up from where he was wiping down a tool like it needed the attention. "It always does," Brian said. I told myself it meant nothing, just a comment about small towns and open space, just a reminder that the plains didn't have the city's constant hum. But the way Brian said it, flat and certain, made the quiet feel less like comfort and more like a condition, like something the night insisted on, and the station had learned not to argue with it. I stayed up longer than I needed to, listening to the building settle, listening to the wind move across empty land, listening for a sound that never came. And when I finally closed my eyes, the first thought that floated through my head wasn't fear. It was relief. Because if nothing happened out here, maybe Denver really had been my mistake. The call came in like most of them did out there, plain and short, the kind of dispatch that didn't come with sirens in your head. A structure fire at a ranch, a good stretch outside town. No report of people trapped. The address was one of those county directions that sounded like a joke until you'd lived there long enough to understand it. Past a turnoff that didn't have a sign. Down a road that wasn't really a road. Follow the fence line until it stopped making sense. We rolled with the engine and the brush truck, tires humming on pavement, then on gravel, then on hard dirt that kicked dust up into the headlights. The wind was already pushing, steady and mean, rocking the rig just enough that you felt it through the seat. Out there, the dark wasn't soft. It was flat and endless, broken only by the weak yellow of porch lights in the distance and the occasional reflection off a metal gate. The moon didn't help. It just made the open land look colder. By the time we saw the glow, it was low on the horizon, not a towering plume, just a steady orange that didn't flicker the way a brush fire did. It looked contained, like it had found something solid to eat and decided to stay put. The ranch driveway was a long cut through grass, and the engine light swept over fence posts and cattle that stood still and watched, eyes catching the beams like glass. The air smelled like dry dirt and manure, and the faint edge of smoke that always hits you before you see the flames up close. A barn sat off to the side, but it wasn't the barn that was burning. It was a smaller outbuilding, something half storage, half workshop, with a tin roof and a wide door on one side. The flames were venting out along the roofline, licking at the wind, but not running with it like they should have. Steve parked us upwind without hesitation. He didn't need to explain why. Even a small structure can throw heat farther than you think when the wind is right, and out here the wind was always right for trouble. We moved the way we'd been moving for weeks. It felt normal. It felt practiced. Brian went straight to the panel on the engine like it was an extension of his hands. Kyle grabbed the hose and started pulling line. I checked my gear like I always did. Straps and buckles and gloves, the little rituals that kept your mind from skipping ahead. I could feel the cold in the air around my neck where the hood didn't cover, and I could feel the heat on my face the closer we got, that fast temperature shift that made your skin tighten. We staged for a defensive attack, same as most ranch structure fires. You don't rush into a detached building at night unless you have a reason. Nobody was screaming. Nobody was running out waving their arms. The ranch house was dark, and the only person we saw was a man standing near a pickup, hands on his hips, staring at the building like he wanted to argue with it. He kept his distance from the flames, but he wasn't afraid of fire. He looked more frustrated than scared, like he'd already done the math on what he was losing. Steve spoke with him briefly while we set up. I didn't hear the words over the wind and the engine noise, but I caught enough to know it was the usual. He didn't think anyone was inside. He'd smelled smoke, seen the glow, called it in. He didn't know how it started. Out here, nobody ever really knew. Something sparks, something catches, the wind does the rest. Brian nodded us into position, and I watched the fire's behavior out of habit. Smoke color, flame angle, how fast it was venting, whether the roofline looked like it was sagging. The wind should have been making the flames lean hard, pushing them sideways like a flag in a storm. Instead, the fire kept rising straight up from the roofline, almost steady. It wasn't calm. It was still aggressive, still hot, still chewing. But it wasn't behaving the way the night said it should. I told myself it was the structure. Wind hitting one side and lifting on the other. A pocket of pressure, a weird draft. Those things happen. You learn not to assign meaning to every odd detail. Kyle got the line charged. The hose stiffened in his hands as water filled it, and the engine's pump tone changed slightly, that deeper mechanical hum you felt through your boots. We opened the nozzle and started knocking down the visible flames from the safest angle, working the pattern the way you're trained. Sweep, pause, hit the base, move. Water hissed and turned to steam. The air thickened with that wet smoke smell, like burnt wood soaked in hot rain. It clung to your throat and made your eyes sting. The wind kept pushing it back at us, and I adjusted my stance to keep my balance. The ground out there wasn't concrete. It shifted under your boots, uneven, pocked with old tire ruts. That's when I heard it. Not a scream, not a voice, something else. A long, stretched sound like metal being pulled under tension. It was thin and high, too steady to be random, and it came in pulses that didn't match the fire's crackle. It wasn't the normal popping of wood or the sharp snap of nails. It sounded like a cable whining, like a sheet of tin bending slow and refusing to give. I froze for half a second, nozzle still in my hands, water continuing to flow. The sound threaded through the wind like it knew how to hide inside it. I leaned slightly toward Kyle without taking my eyes off the structure. "You hear that?" I asked. Kyle didn't even glance at me. He was watching the flame edge like he was supposed to. "Hear what?" Kyle asked. The sound came again, a little stronger this time, and my shoulders tensed without permission. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just wrong in a way my body recognized. That was the problem. The scream in Denver had hit like a hammer. This was a needle, small, precise. It found a place under my ribs and stayed there. I remembered the folded paper in my pocket without touching it. Rule 1. Ask the person beside you. If they don't hear it, you do not advance. A rational part of my brain wanted to argue. This wasn't a scream. It wasn't even a person sound. It could have been anything. Tin roof, expanding steel, a tool inside shifting, wind catching a loose panel. 100 normal explanations that didn't deserve respect. But the rules hadn't said you only follow them when it's convenient. The rules were written like they expected your brain to negotiate, and they weren't interested in compromise. Brian's voice cut in from behind us, calm and immediate, like he'd been listening to my question more than the fire. "Step back," Brian said. He didn't shout. He didn't add a why. He just said it like it was the next move in the drill. I eased back 2 steps, keeping the line steady while Kyle held position. The wind hit my face harder as soon as I shifted, and in the same moment the sound stopped. Not faded, not drifted away. Stopped. Like someone had flipped a switch. My stomach dropped. I kept moving anyway, just to prove it to myself. One more step back, then another, putting space between me and the structure. Nothing. Just the normal fire noise again. Crackle, hiss, steam, the wind chewing through it all. I looked over at Brian. He wasn't staring at the building. He was staring at me. Not in a friendly way, not in an accusing way, in a measuring way, like he'd just watched me pass a test I didn't know I was taking. Steve walked up closer, eyes on the roofline. His posture stayed relaxed, but his attention sharpened, the way it does when you've decided you're not going to give a situation any extra chances. "Defensive only," Steve said. He said it like he was confirming what we were already doing, but it landed heavier than that. It sounded like a reminder, aimed at me, not at the fire. We kept working it from the outside, water and steam and shifting wind. The fire resisted for a while, then started to give, the flames shrinking down from the roofline as we cooled it. The structure didn't collapse, no sudden flare, no dramatic moment where something chased us back. It behaved like a normal ranch outbuilding fire, stubborn but predictable, the kind of thing you could write a clean report on. When the visible flames were down, we moved into overhaul from the safest spots, pulling charred pieces away with pike poles, checking for hot spots with the thermal, making sure it wasn't going to reignite once we left. The ranch owner kept his distance, arms wrapped around himself against the cold, watching us with that blank expression people get when they're tired and angry and trying not to show it. Kyle nudged me lightly with his elbow when we had a second, not enough to be a joke, just enough to check in without making it a conversation. I didn't want to look shaken. I didn't want to be the guy whose ears were still the problem. So I gave him the simplest explanation that would end it. "It was probably metal," I told him. Kyle nodded like that made sense. Out here, metal did weird things in the wind. Out here, buildings made noises that didn't translate. Out here, you could blame half your worries on weather and be right more often than not. But even as I said it, I knew the part that didn't fit. It wasn't the sound itself that bothered me. It was the way it stopped the second I stepped back, clean and final, like it had been waiting to see what I would do, like it had been listening for my decision. Back at the station, I cleaned my gear slower than usual, hands moving carefully over straps and buckles as if going slow could change what I'd heard. Brian didn't bring it up. Steve didn't bring it up. Kyle didn't bring it up. Nobody said the word rule. Nobody said scream. Nobody even looked at the paper in my pocket. That was what made it worse than if they'd teased me about it. They acted like this was normal, like a 4-man crew could build an entire policy around something that didn't exist, and then follow it in the dark without needing to explain a single thing. The next call came 2 nights later, and it didn't feel like the ranch outbuilding. It felt like the kind of call that belonged on the news, even if nobody out here watched the news the same way. A house fire in open country. A single-family place set back from the road with nothing close enough to threaten, which meant there wouldn't be a wall of neighbors outside. But it also meant help was far. Out there, every minute mattered more because you couldn't borrow minutes from the next station over. We rolled hard, engine lights carving through darkness, wind slapping the side of the cab like a hand that wouldn't stop. The farther we got from town, the flatter the land became, like someone had ironed it. The sky was huge, and it made the small things feel smaller. Fences, cattle, a mailbox leaning on a post, a long driveway that looked like it could lead anywhere because everything out there looked the same until you were right on top of it. We saw the glow before we saw the house. It sat low on the horizon, steady and bright, like someone had built a bonfire and forgot to put it out. The wind should have made it flicker. It should have thrown sparks and pushed flames sideways. Instead, the light held, constant and contained, like it had a center it didn't want to leave. Steve pulled the engine in upwind again, and I got out into air that felt cold enough to crack your knuckles. The smell hit next, thick and immediate. Burning wood, plastics, insulation, and something sour underneath, like an old house, finally letting go of every odor it had soaked up over the years. The wind should have carried that smell away, but it stayed around us, circling back like it didn't want to leave either. The house was a one-story place with a low roofline, the kind of ranch style you see everywhere in the West. A porch light still glowed, weirdly calm against the orange. One window had already failed and vented, flames rolling out and licking along the eaves. The front door was shut. No cars in the driveway, no people outside, no running footsteps, just fire and wind and the distance between us and anyone who could tell us what mattered. Kyle and I pulled line while Brian went to the engine panel. Steve stayed close to the radio, listening, scanning. We didn't have the luxury of making this complicated. We were 4 guys, 2 rigs, and whatever water we had in the tank until we could establish a supply. Out there, hydrants weren't guaranteed. Sometimes you got a cistern, sometimes you got nothing. You learned to respect water the way you respected air. The wind was strong enough to make my helmet strap tug against my chin. It kept pressing smoke low, flattening it to the ground so it rolled across the yard like fog. It made the scene look bigger than it was, wider and more alive. Embers lifted and died in the dark. The grass around the house was dry, and I kept expecting the fire to run into it and take off. It didn't. The grass smoked in places where heat kissed it, but it didn't catch. The flames stayed with the house, clinging to the structure like they'd made an agreement. That's when I noticed the flame behavior wasn't just steady. It was too steady. The fire was venting and moving the way it should inside the structure, but the visible flames along the opening weren't being shaped by the wind the way they should have been. They rose and curled straight up, almost like the wind wasn't there. I told myself it was pressure differences in ventilation paths and the way this particular house was built. I told myself that because it was the only explanation that didn't make my skin crawl. We got the line charged and advanced to a defensive position near the front, keeping the angle safe, watching for any sign of collapse. The roofline didn't sag. The windows didn't fail in a cascade the way they sometimes do. Nothing dramatic happened. It was like the fire was waiting. Steve looked at the front door and then at the side of the structure, calculating. I could see it in the way his eyes moved. Where would you go in? Where would you not go in? Where would you place your people so you could pull them back without losing them? I took a breath through my mask and felt the air come in cool and clean from the bottle. That always surprised me, even after years. Fire all around you, smoke thick enough to blot out stars, and inside that mask it still felt like standing in a refrigerated aisle at a grocery store. It was a lie you depended on. I was holding position, nozzle aimed, waiting for Steve to decide whether we'd make entry or stay defensive when the scream hit. Not faint, not stretched, not something you could argue into being metal. A full, clear human scream, sharp with panic, carrying straight through wind and fire noise like it had its own path to my ear. It sounded close, too close, like it was right behind the front door. My muscles tightened so fast the hose jerked in my hands. For a split second, my brain went empty, the way it does when your body decides something matters more than thought. Heat kissed my face shield. Smoke pressed low. The scream came again, and it didn't warp. It didn't fade. It didn't get swallowed by distance. I turned my head slightly toward Kyle without taking my eyes off the house. "You hear that?" I asked. Kyle didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on the fire, and I could see him making a choice in real time. He swallowed, his jaw flexed. He looked like he was fighting the urge to pretend he hadn't heard anything, because pretending would have been easier. "Yeah," Kyle said quietly. My stomach dropped, not because I wanted confirmation, but because part of me had hoped I'd be alone in it. If I was alone in it, I could blame my own head. Stress, memory, the warehouse, all that baggage following me like a shadow. If Kyle heard it too, then the problem wasn't just mine anymore. The scream kept coming. It wasn't a word. It wasn't my name. It was pure distress, repeated in the same pitch, the same urgency, like a loop that didn't get tired. Brian glanced at us, then back at the house. He didn't look surprised. That was the thing that made my throat go tight. He looked like he was confirming something he already expected. "That's not a victim," Brian said flatly. Steve stepped closer, eyes hard, listening like a man listening for a car engine on a quiet road. He cocked his head slightly, then shook it once. "I don't hear a damn thing," Steve said. There it was. The split, clean and sharp. 3 of us standing in the same cold wind, looking at the same burning house, and we weren't experiencing the same scene. Kyle and I heard it. Brian heard it. Steve didn't. The instinct that had gotten me in trouble in Denver rose up like it recognized its chance. It pushed at my chest. It tried to turn my feet forward. That scream was everything a firefighter's brain is built to respond to. You hear it and you move. You don't stand there and debate it like you're in a meeting. You go. The rules sat in my pocket like weight. Rule 1, ask the person beside you. I did, Kyle confirmed. Rule 4, if you're the one who hears it, you don't lead the entry. That wasn't a problem if Steve led. Except Steve didn't hear it, and a man won't risk his crew on a sound he can't confirm without something more solid to justify it. Rule 3 was waiting in the dark, too. If the voice uses your name, no one enters. It hadn't used a name. Not yet. My hands tightened on the hose until my knuckles hurt. The scream came again, and the fire stayed steady, almost polite, holding itself in place like it didn't want to spook us into leaving. It sounds close. My voice came out lower than I expected. Steve's eyes snapped to me, not angry, focused, measuring, like he could see the warehouse written on my face. He didn't order me forward. He didn't order me back. He let me hang there for a breath, because sometimes you can learn more from how a man holds himself than from what he says. Kyle shifted his weight beside me. I could feel him wanting to move, too, like his body had its own plan. That scared me more than the scream. Kyle didn't have my history. He didn't have my guilt. He didn't have a reason to be haunted by Denver. He heard it, and his instincts kicked in like they were supposed to. That meant the scream was hitting something simple and universal inside us, a switch we all carried. Brian didn't move. That was the other contrast. He wasn't frozen from fear. He was still on purpose, like a man who'd learned that stillness was sometimes the only way to survive. His eyes stayed on the structure, tracking flame movement, tracking smoke, tracking the door, but he didn't take a step closer. Steve made a decision that looked like a decision you'd make on any rural house fire with no confirmed occupants. He kept us outside. He kept us safe. He chose the move that didn't get anyone killed based on information he could stand behind. We stayed defensive. We worked the opening from the safest angle, cooling what we could, pushing back flame without committing into the structure. We moved in small increments, watching the roofline, watching for sag, watching for signs the fire was extending into the attic. The scream kept coming, and it never turned into words. It never begged. It never changed. It didn't rise with the heat or fade when we knocked down flame. It didn't do the normal things a real person's voice does when it's attached to lungs and pain and exhaustion. That should have made it easier to ignore. It didn't. It made it worse. Because it meant whatever was making that sound wasn't getting tired. The fire still didn't spread to the grass, not even when embers rolled out in the wind. The dry yard smoked and darkened, but it didn't catch. I watched a small tongue of flame lick down toward the ground and then pull back like it hit an invisible line. The house burned, but the world around it stayed untouched, like the fire had boundaries it respected. Steve called for water supply and had Kyle and me hold line while Brian adjusted the attack. The brush truck staged on the edge, ready to stop any spot fires that might pop up. They didn't. The wind kept pushing, but the fire stayed with the structure, and the scream stayed with the fire. At one point, I caught myself looking at the front door like I expected it to open, like I expected someone to come running out, coughing and staggering into the yard, proving me right, making all of this worth it. Nothing opened. Nothing came out. The only movement beyond us was the flame itself, steady as a heartbeat that didn't belong to a human body. Kyle glanced at me once, a quick look that asked a question he couldn't say without sounding scared. I didn't have an answer. I wanted to tell him it was fine, that it was wind distortion, that it was metal, that it was anything normal. I couldn't. I'd heard normal fires. Normal fires didn't sound like this. Brian stayed quiet, his face set in that flat certainty that made me want to argue and also made me want to listen. Steve stayed focused on what he could confirm and control. Flame, structure, crew safety, and me, I stayed where the rules said to stay. Outside, hands on the hose, heart pounding, listening to a scream that didn't belong to anyone we could save. We put the fire out the way we put out any house fire, slowly, deliberately, until there wasn't enough heat left to sustain it. When the flames finally died down, the scream didn't taper off the way you'd expect. It stopped mid-breath, clean and sudden, like it had never existed at all. The silence afterward was worse. Kyle exhaled hard, and I realized he'd been holding his breath without noticing. Steve scanned the house one more time, then looked to Brian like he was waiting for something. Brian didn't give him anything. He just stared at the dark opening where the window had been, eyes unreadable. We didn't find a victim. We didn't find a body. We didn't even find signs of someone trying to get out. No footprints in the dirt, no broken latch, no blood, no phone tossed on the floor. Nothing that would make the scream real in a report. Back in the rig, as we rolled away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror until the glow disappeared behind us. The wind kept pushing at the engine, steady and indifferent. The planes swallowed the light and the night went back to being quiet. I didn't say a word. Neither did Kyle. And that, more than anything, told me this wasn't just my problem anymore. We didn't talk about the scream the next day. That was its own kind of agreement. When dispatch sent us out again that night, the voice on the radio sounded the same as always. Calm, clean, like it was reading off a grocery list. Another structure fire outside town, another stretch of road where your headlights were the only lights that mattered. We drove in a quiet that felt practiced. The cab smelled like diesel and rubber and the faint smoke that never fully left your gear bag. Kyle stared straight ahead like he was trying not to think. Brian sat still with his hands folded, calm in a way that didn't feel like confidence. Steve drove steady, both hands on the wheel, eyes flicking between the road and the glow in the distance, as if he'd already seen this exact scene before. The glow was smaller than the house fire from the night before, but it was wrong in a different way. It was too concentrated, a tight orange pulse sitting on the plane like a lantern somebody forgot to put out. No trail of sparks, no scatter into the wind, just a fixed point in the dark. The structure was a detached shop set back from a ranch house that sat dark and quiet farther off. Metal siding, pitched roof, wide door that had either been left open or had failed already. Flames worked inside and rolled out in slow waves, but the wind didn't shape them the way it should have. The grass around it bent hard under gusts strong enough to make the brush truck's antenna whip, and still the flames rose almost straight up, steady as if the air around the fire was still. Steve parked us upwind. We got out, and the cold hit like a slap. It wasn't the kind of cold you joke about. It was the kind that made your hands ache inside your gloves and made your breath feel sharp in your throat, even with the mask. The smell came next, thick and immediate, that mix of burning wood and plastics and whatever had been stored inside, layered with a sour note that made my stomach tighten. The wind should have carried it away. Instead, it circled back and sat on us. We moved on muscle memory, hose line off the engine, pump engaged, tools staged. The brush truck took a position to handle any spread to grass, even though the yard looked untouched, just like the night before. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. It felt like watching a fire ignore easy fuel on purpose. The scream started before we even put water on it. Clear. Human. Close enough that my body tried to move toward it without asking permission. It didn't come from one corner of the structure or the doorway the way you'd expect. It came from the fire itself, threaded through the roar and crackle like it belonged there. My grip tightened on the hose. My shoulders rose under my gear. I felt the same old reflex from Denver wake up and start shoving at my ribs. Kyle stiffened beside me. I didn't need to ask him if he heard it. I could see it in the way his breathing changed, in the way his eyes locked on the opening like he wanted to force the sound to match something real. Brian's face didn't change at all, which told me everything. Steve watched us more than the structure for a moment, reading what he couldn't hear. We started defensive, the only move that made sense with no confirmed occupants and a crew this small. The nozzle opened, and the water hit the edge of flame, hissing hard, turning to steam that rose in a thick rush. That was when another detail landed wrong. The steam lifted straight up instead of getting ripped sideways by wind. Steam is honest. It always follows air movement. Tonight it climbed like the wind wasn't there. The scream kept coming, steady, the same pitch and the same urgency, like a loop that didn't get tired. It didn't change when we hit it with water. It didn't break into coughing. It didn't weaken the way a real voice does when it's attached to lungs and heat and pain. That should have made it easier to ignore. It made it worse. It meant whatever was making that sound didn't need air. I held position and forced myself not to step closer. The rules sat in my pocket like weight. I'd already learned on the ranch call that stepping back ended the noise clean and sudden. I didn't want to test the opposite. I didn't want to find out what happened if I gave it what it wanted. Kyle shifted his feet like his body had its own plan. That scared me more than the scream. Kyle didn't have my history. He didn't have the warehouse sitting in the back of his head. He heard the sound and reacted the way firefighters are wired to react. Brian didn't move at all. He stayed still on purpose, eyes tracking flame behavior and smoke, waiting for the scene to show its hand. Then the scream shifted. It didn't get louder or softer. It changed tone, like a person letting go of panic. The raw edge fell away. What replaced it wasn't calm exactly. It was flatter, patient, and underneath it was something that made my skin tighten under my hood, like the sound carried weight that didn't belong to a human throat. It sounded almost disappointed. The wind dropped, not eased, not shifted, dropped like someone turned it off. The grass stopped moving. The smoke stopped smearing across the yard. The air went still in a way that didn't feel natural, and the engine noise suddenly seemed too loud because there was nothing else in the world moving. The flames stopped advancing. They stopped rolling out and licking along the door frame. They held in place, gathered tight, as if the fire had pulled itself inward and was waiting. I felt watched, not the way you feel watched by a person in a window, but the way you feel watched when something notices you, the way you notice a sound in the dark. Brian moved just enough to bring his mouth closer to my ear without making it a big motion. "Don't move," Brian said quietly. My legs were already tense. Every instinct in me wanted to step forward, to close distance, to make the scream into a problem I could solve with training and effort. Brian's voice pinned me better than a shout would have. It wasn't fear in his tone. It was discipline. It was a man who'd learned the cost of moving at the wrong moment. Kyle's breathing got faster, a faint rasp inside his mask. I wanted to tell him to slow down, to focus on the line, to keep his head. I didn't. I didn't want to break whatever fragile control we still had. Steve took one pace forward, just enough to see our faces under our helmet brims. He studied us, trying to read what we were hearing without being able to hear it himself. His jaw set. He didn't order entry. He didn't argue. He held to what he could confirm: fire behavior, crew safety, the fact that none of this matched a normal scene. The scream came again, and for a split second, it wasn't a scream at all. It was like a voice trying to settle into a shape it could use. It flattened, steadier, closer to speech without ever forming words. The hair on my neck tried to rise. My mouth went dry behind the mask. I felt the choice in my body the same way I'd felt it in Denver, training on one side, instinct on the other. Except this time, the instinct wasn't telling me to save somebody. It was telling me to prove something, to fix what I'd broken, to make the story end different. I forced myself to speak, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to make it real. "I'm not going in," I said. The words came out steady, and that surprised me. I expected my voice to shake. I expected anger. I expected shame. What I felt was a hard kind of clarity, like I'd finally stopped arguing with myself. The fire reacted. Not with a flare or an explosion. It did something more controlled and more wrong. The flames pulled inward, folding back into the opening like a curtain being drawn. The orange collapsed toward a center point I couldn't see, and then it dropped all at once, like somebody yanked the heat out of the structure. The light fell fast, too fast for water to have done it. Steam surged in one thick wave, and then thinned. The roar died to crackle and then to nothing. For a beat, the wind still didn't return. The silence stayed, heavy enough to feel. The scream was gone, cut off clean mid-breath like it had never existed at all. We moved in cautiously after that, the way you move when you know a scene can still hurt you even after it looks quiet. Steve kept it conservative. Overhaul from the edges, check for hot spots, pull siding where it was safe, thermal sweep. The structure should have shown patterns, a seat of fire, direction of spread, heat trapped in corners. Instead, it looked wrong, like the burn had happened without choosing a path. No debris pattern that matched a collapse, no fresh holes punched through by falling weight, no signs of someone crawling, no footprints in ash, no dropped phone, no remains, nothing to justify the sound. Steve stared into the blackened opening, then looked at me like he'd finally decided what he believed about Denver. "Good," Steve said. He didn't say it like praise. He said it like relief, like he'd been waiting for that exact decision. On the ride back, the wind returned in small gusts, as if the world remembered how it was supposed to work. Dust drifted through the headlights. The planes went back to being open and indifferent. I kept seeing the way the flames had held, the way the scream had shifted, the way everything collapsed inward the moment I refused. And I understood, with a cold certainty I didn't want, that the sound wasn't a person asking to be saved. It was a hook. It didn't need rescuing. It needed someone to enter. Weeks passed without anything that felt like a test. The calls kept coming, but they were the kind you could write clean reports on. Brush fires that started from something careless and died when we boxed them in. False alarms that ended with a reset and an apology. A small vehicle fire on the shoulder that smelled like burning plastic and hot oil and nothing else. Normal work in a place that didn't have room for drama. And the thing I didn't say out loud, even to myself at first, was that the sound was gone for me. No faint metallic stretch in the wind, no sharp human scream cutting through fire noise, no moment where my body tensed before my brain knew why. It was like something had reached for me, missed, and then decided I wasn't worth the effort anymore. The first time I noticed that, I felt relief so strong it made me angry. Relief didn't feel earned. It felt like getting away with something. I kept the folded rules in my locker. I didn't throw them out. I didn't reread them every shift either. I didn't want to turn them into prayer. I wanted them to stay what Steve had meant them to be. A line you didn't cross. A reminder that the job didn't care about your guilt. Steve never brought it up again. Brian didn't either. That didn't mean they'd forgotten. It meant they didn't believe talking made it safer. They treated it the way firefighters treat scars. You acknowledge they're there, and you stop picking at them. Kyle was different after that night, not in a big, obvious way. He still joked when it was safe to joke. He still cooked heavy meals and complained about the wind like the wind could hear him. He still checked the rigs like checking them twice could summon a call. But there were small changes, the kind you notice only when you're forced to watch someone closely. He listened more, not to the radio, to the space between sounds. He stared into fires longer than he needed to, like he expected the flames to do something other than burn. I didn't ask him about it. I didn't want to plant anything in his head that wasn't already there. I told myself he'd settle, that it was just the echo of a bad call, the way any firefighter carries a scene for a while before it fades. I told myself that because it was the only way to sleep. One night, weeks later, we caught a brush fire along a fence line outside town. Dry grass and wind, the usual combination. Nothing near structures, no one reporting injuries, just a thin line of flame, moving low and quick, eating what it could and trying to outrun us. We positioned the engine upwind and worked it the way we always did. Water and flappers, the brush truck circling the far edge to keep it boxed in. The smoke was lighter than a structure fire, more like burnt straw than poison. The heat was close, but manageable. It was routine. Kyle stood a few feet off the line, watching the edge where flame met grass. At first, I thought he was just tracking for a spot fire. Then, I saw him stop moving entirely, like his body had hit a pause button. He tilted his head slightly, listening, eyes fixed on the fire like it was speaking in a language he'd just started to understand. I felt my throat tighten. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. "You hear something?" I asked. Kyle didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the flames, and his answer came out small, like he didn't want to admit it was real. "Yeah," Kyle said. The wind pushed smoke across the line, and for a second it wrapped around him and turned his silhouette into a shadow against orange light. He didn't step closer. He didn't step back. He just stood there, listening, like the sound had found him, and he didn't know yet what it wanted. I watched him for another beat, then turned back to the work. That's what you do in this job when you don't have an answer. You keep your hands moving, you keep the line, you finish the call, you get everyone home. Later, back at the station, I lay in my bunk and listened to the building settle in the wind. I tried not to think about Denver. I tried not to think about the rules. I tried not to think about the way the scream had turned flat and patient right before the wind died. It didn't matter what I tried not to think about. The truth sat there anyway, steady and cold. Most of us only hear it once.